Hey y'all, it is Wednesday, May 6th, and I am here today to read to you chapters 14 and 15 of Number the Stars by Lois Lowry. I will tell you today you will be hearing the climax of the story. So we are still in the rising action part of the story. So we have our setting is Copenhagen, Denmark. It has changed though because it went to Gilleleje, which is where Uncle Henrik lives, but it's also still in Denmark. Our characters being the Rosens, the Johansons, Uncle Henrik, even Peter Nielsen, some minor characters, the young couple with the baby and the old man, but and of course the Nazi soldiers. And then the time period, the when and where. So we have the when being during World War II, so in the 1940s, like 1943. And now we've been kind of climbing up the mountain and reading all about the rising action. So every time there's a moment where there's Nazi soldiers involved, where Anne-Marie and Ellen are having a conversation, all of those events are taking place as part of the rising action. And now we are so close to that climax right at the top of the mountain. You will hear that today. So there is an oh my moment. There is a moment where you are going to just be like, I can't even believe this is happening. But today I will be reading chapters 14 and 15 to you. And then tomorrow I am going to be posting the study guide that goes with the quiz for chapters 11 through 15. And then you'll be taking the quiz for chapters 11 through 15 on Friday. So you have the 14 and 15 today is Wednesday. The study guide will be tomorrow, Thursday, and then the quiz will be on Friday. And then we've kind of been, hopefully you've seen a little bit of a pattern. I've been giving you like a day off on the day after the quiz, and you will be using that day to work on your ABC book. So listen, there's only 17 chapters in Number the Stars, and if we're finishing up chapter 15 today, that means you only have 2 chapters left. So we're very close to the end. Remember, you are going to have this quiz for 11 through 15 plus your exit ticket grades as we go. But then there'll be a final test, and I'll be grading your Number the Stars ABC book. So make sure you're keeping up on that work. On those days that I give you to work on that, make sure you're working on that. But then you can also work on that any other day that you would like as well. So if it's kind of a yucky rainy day and you're trying to figure out what to do, you can spend a little bit of time working on the ABC book. It's meant to be fun and a little bit of a reflection on Number the Stars. So A is for Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie is important to the story because she's one of the main characters. And then a picture of what you think Anne-Marie looks like. And you could even pull that picture from Google Images of Number the Stars. There is not a Number the Stars movie. So these characters that you are kind of seeing you're seeing in your head. So even if you just find a picture online of what you think Inga Johansson looks like, or what you think the Rosen mom and dad looks like, I'm fine with that. I'm not going to be picky on what they look like because what you visualize might be different than what I visualize, and that's totally fine. Not a big deal at all. But you do need to have a picture for each slide, and you do need to have an explanation on each slide. And some of them were done for you. I did A is for Anne-Marie. I did Z is for Zion. I did X for King Christian X. And you should be kind of filling that in as you go with different words and different things that are happening in the story. All right, so here we go. Chapter 14, On the Dark Path. If you remember yesterday, we finished up with chapter 13, and we found out that Mama had broken her ankle on the way back from delivering the Rosen family to Henrik. Henrik had them on their boat. He's taking these people to safety, away from the Nazi soldiers where they were in for certain death. I mean, truly, he was saving their lives. Anne-Marie's mom was saving their lives. So at this point, in chapter 13, we find out that Mr. Rosen had dropped the packet that was so important that Inga was like, oh my gosh, we maybe did all of this for nothing. This is horrible. He needs this packet. It could have all been for nothing. Oh my God. And then Anne-Marie says, well, I'll take it because you can't take it. You have a broken ankle from falling on the twisted, gnarled root. So I'll take it. And her mom had just told her, take that packet, put it kind of at the bottom of the basket, then put a cloth napkin on top of that and put some fruit and some cheese and some bread in a basket. And then you take this to your Uncle Henrik and you have to run. So that's where, and run as fast as you can was the name of that last chapter. So that makes total sense. So this one is on the dark path. Now remember, it's still like 4 o'clock in the morning. So the sun would just be starting to come up slightly, but for the most part, it's still dark out at 4 o'clock in the morning. All right, here we go. Only now, entering the woods on the footpath, did Anne-Marie realize how cold the dawn was. She had watched and helped earlier as the others donned sweaters, jackets, and coats, and she had peered into the night, following them with her eyes as they moved silently off, bulky in their garments, blankets in their arms. But she wore only a light sweater over her cotton dress. Though the October day later would be warmed by sunlight, now it was gray, chilly, and damp, and she shivered. The path curved, and she could no longer look behind her and see the clearing with the farmhouse outlined against the pale sky and the lightning meadow beyond. Now there were only the dark woods ahead. Underfoot, the path, latticed with thick roots, hidden under the fallen leaves, was invisible. She felt her way with her feet, trying not to stumble. The handle of the straw basket scratched her arm through her sweater. She shifted it and tried to run. She thought of a story she had often told Kirsty as they cuddled in bed at night. Once upon a time, there was a little girl, she told herself silently, who had a beautiful red cloak. Her mother had made it for her. She wore it so often that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. Kirsty would always interrupt there. Why was it called a Red Riding Hood? Kirsty would ask. Why didn't they just call her Little Red Cloak? Well, it had a hood that covered her head. She had beautiful curls like you, Kirsty. Maybe someday Mama will make you a coat with a hood to cover your curls and keep you warm. But why? Kirsty would ask. Was it a riding hood? Was she riding a horse? Maybe she had a horse that she rode sometimes, but not in this story. Now stop interrupting every minute. Anne-Marie smiled, feeling her way through the dark, remembering how Kirsty always interrupted stories to ask questions. Often she just wanted to make the story last longer. The story continued. One day, the little girl's mother said, I want you to take a basket of food to your grandmother. She is sick in bed. Come, let me tie your red cloak. The grandmother lived deep in the woods, didn't she? Kirsty would ask. In the dangerous woods where wolves lived. Okay, now think about this for a minute. I kind of find this funny because here you have Anne-Marie, 10, 11 years old. She's walking through the woods. She knows the mission she is on is dangerous. She's telling herself a story to calm herself down. And the story that she is telling herself to calm herself down is the story of Little Red Riding Hood, which is a story that she often told Kirsty. Okay, I get it. You're going to talk to yourself to calm yourself down. But if you're in the woods and you're trying to calm yourself down, do you think Little Red Riding Hood is the story that you would want to tell? The one where the wolf is in the woods and scares Little Red Riding Hood and ends up eating her grandma and that whole thing? Like, that to me would make me more paranoid, more anxious, more scared and nervous than just telling myself the story of like The Little Mermaid, which is a story that she had told earlier in our book, or the story that she made up with Kings and Queens for Kirsty. Instead, she's thinking Little Red Riding Hood. But I feel like there's a connection here because here is Anne Marie, who has her basket that she's taken to Uncle Henrik. She's walking through the woods. So this is the story that popped up in her mind. Hopefully she doesn't meet any big bad wolf on the path. Anne Marie heard a small noise, a squirrel perhaps, or a rabbit scampering nearby. She paused, stood still on the path, and smiled again. Kirsty would have been frightened. She would have grabbed Anne Marie's hand and said, "A wolf!" But Anne Marie knew that these woods were not like the woods in the story. There were no wolves or bears or tigers, none of the beasts that populated Kirsty's vivid imagination. So seeing something clearly in your mind. Still, she hurried on. She hurried on. Still, they were very dark, these woods. Anne Marie had never followed this path in the dark before. She had told her mother she would run, and she tried. Here the path turned. She knew the turning well, though it seemed different in the dark. If she turned to the left, it would take her to the road, out where it would be lighter, wider, and more traveled. But more dangerous, too. Someone could see her on the road. At this time of the dawn, other fishermen would be on the road hurrying to their boats for the long day at sea, and there might be soldiers. She turned to the right instead and headed deeper into the woods. It was why Mama and Peter had needed to guide those who were strangers here, the Rosens and the others. One wrong turn would have taken them into danger. So, she tells herself, Little Red Riding Hood carried the basket of food and hurried along through the woods. It was a lovely morning. Birds were singing. Little Red Riding Hood sang, too, as she walked. Sometimes she changed that part of the story, telling it to Kirsty. Sometimes it was raining or even snowing in the woods. Sometimes it was evening with long, frightening shadows so that Kirsty, listening, would snuggle in closer and wrap her arms around Anne Marie. But now, telling it to herself, she wanted sunlight and birds singing. Why do you think she would want sunlight and birds singing instead of shadows and creepy evening? Because she's the one walking through the woods and she doesn't want to scare her own self. That's funny. Here the path widened and flattened. It was the place where the woods opened on one side and the path curved beside a meadow at the edge of the sea. Here she could run, and she did. Here in daylight, there would be cows in the meadow, and on summer afternoons, Anne Marie would always stop by the fence and hold out handfuls of grass, which the curious cows would take with their rough tongues. Here her mother had told her Mama always stopped, too, as a child, walking to school. Her dog, Trofast, would wriggle under the fence and run about in the meadow, barking excitedly, trying to chase the cows who always ignored him. The meadow was empty now, though, and colorless in the half-light. She could hear the churning sea beyond and see the wash of daylight to the east over Sweden. She ran as fast as she could, searching with her eyes for the place ahead where the path would re-enter the woods for its final segment, which led to town. Here, the bushes were overgrown, and it was difficult to see the path. But she found the entrance beside the high blueberry bushes. How often she had stopped here in late summer to pick a handful of the sweet berries and eat them. Her hands and mouth would be all blue afterwards, and Mama always laughed when she came home. But now it was dark again, and the trees and bushes closed in around her, and she had to move more slowly, though she still tried to run. Anne Marie thought of Mama, her ankles so swollen and her face so pained. She hoped Mama had called the doctor by now. The local doctor was an old man, very businesslike, but he had kind eyes. He had come to the farmhouse several times during the summers of the past, his battered car noisy on the dirt road. He had come once when Kirsty, a tiny baby then, had been sick and wailing with an earache. And he had come when Lise had spilled hot grease cooking breakfast and burned her hand. Anne Marie turned again as the path divided once more. The left fork would take her directly to the village. It was the way they had come from the train, and the way Mama had walked to school as a girl. But Anne Marie turned to the right, heading now toward the harbor side, where the fishing boats lay at anchor. She had often come this way before, too, sometimes at the end of the afternoon, to pick out the Ingeborg, Uncle Henrik's boat, from the many returning, and to watch him and his helpers unload the day's catch of slippery, shimmering herring fish still flopping in their containers. Even now, with the boats in the harbor ahead empty of fish, preparing to leave for the day's fishing, she could smell the oily, salty scent of herring, which always remained in the air here. It wasn't far now, and it was getting lighter. She ran almost as fast as she had run at school in the Friday foot races, almost as fast as she had run down the Copenhagen sidewalk on that day that the soldier had stopped her with his call of halt. Anne-Marie continued the story in her head. Suddenly, as Little Red Riding Hood walked through the woods, she heard a noise. She heard a rustling in the bushes. A wolf! Kirsty would always say, shivering with fearful delight. I know it's going to be the wolf. Anne-Marie always tried to prolong this part, to build up the suspense and tantalize her sister. She didn't know what it was. She stopped on the path and listened. Something was following her in the bushes. Little Red Riding Hood was very, very, very frightened. She would stop, would stay silent for a moment, and beside her in the bed, she could feel Kirsty holding her breath, waiting for the next part of the story. Then, Anne-Marie would go on in a low, dread-filled voice, she heard a growl. Anne-Marie stopped suddenly and stood still on the path. There was a turn immediately ahead. Beyond it, she knew as soon as she rounded the turn, she would see the landscape open to the sea. The woods would be behind her there, and ahead of her would be the harbor, the docks, and the countless fishing boats. She was almost there. Very soon it would be very noisy, with engines starting, fishermen calling to one another, and gulls crying out. But she had heard something else. She heard bushes rustling ahead. She heard footsteps. And she was certain it was not her imagination. She heard a low growl. Curiously, she took a step forward, and another. She approached the turn in the path, and the noises continued. Then they were there, in front of her. 4 armed soldiers. With them, straining at taut leashes, were 2 large dogs, their eyes glittering, their lips curled. And that's the end of chapter 14. Oh my gosh. So the end of chapter 14, listen. Curiously, she took a step forward, and another. She approached the turn in the path, and the noises continued. Then they were there, in front of her. 4 armed soldiers. With them, straining at taut leashes, were 2 large dogs. Wolves. Their eyes glittering, their lips curled. Okay, here we go. Chapter 15, My Dogs Smell Meat. Anne-Marie's mind raced. She remembered what her mother had said. If anyone stops you, you must pretend to be nothing more than a silly little girl. She stared at the soldiers. She remembered how she had stared at the others, frightened when they had stopped her on the street. Kirsty hadn't been frightened, though. Kirsty had been, well, nothing more than a silly little girl, angered because the soldier had touched her hair that afternoon. She had known nothing of danger, and the soldier had been amused by her. Anne-Marie willed herself with all of her being to behave just as Kirsty would. Good morning, she said carefully to the soldiers. They looked her up and down in silence. Both dogs were tense and alert. The 2 soldiers who held the leashes wore thick gloves. What are you doing here? One of them asked. Anne-Marie held out her basket with the thick loaf of bread visible. My Uncle Henrik forgot his lunch, and I'm taking it to him. He's a fisherman. The soldiers were looking around. Their eyes glanced behind her and scanned the bushes on either side. "Are you alone?" one asked. Anne-Marie nodded. "Yes," she said. One of the dogs growled, but she noticed that both dogs were looking at her lunch basket. One soldier stepped forward. The other and two holding the dogs remained where they were. "You came out before daybreak just to bring a lunch? Why doesn't your uncle eat fish?" What would Kirsty reply? Anne-Marie tried to giggle the way that her sister might. "Uncle Henrik doesn't even like fish," she said, laughing. "He says he sees too much of it and smells too much of it. Anyway, he wouldn't eat it raw." She made a face. "Well, I suppose he would if he were, starving, but Uncle Henrik always has bread and cheese for lunch." "Keep chattering," she told herself, just as Kirsty would. A silly little girl. "I like fish," she went on. "I like it the way my mother cooks it. Sometimes she rolls it in breadcrumbs and..." The soldier reached forward and grabbed the crisp loaf of bread from the basket. He examined it carefully. Then he broke it in half, pulling the two halves apart with his fist. Well, that would enrage Kirsty, she knew. "Hey, don't!" she said angrily. "That's my Uncle Henrik's bread. My mother baked it." The soldier ignored her. He tossed the two halves of the loaf to the ground, one half in front of each dog. They consumed it, each snapping at the bread and gulping it up so that it was gone in an instant. "Have you seen anyone in the woods?" The soldier barked the question at her. "No, only you." Anne-Marie stared at him. "What are you doing in the woods anyway? You're making me late. Uncle Henrik's boat will leave before I get there with his lunch, or what's left of his lunch." The soldier picked up the wedge of cheese. He turned it over in his hand. He turned to the three behind him and asked them something in their own language. One of them answered "Nein" in a bored tone. Anne-Marie recognized the word. The man had replied no. He had probably been asked, Anne-Marie thought, "Do you want this cheese? Or perhaps should I give the cheese to the dogs?" The soldier continued to hold the cheese. He tossed it back and forth between his hands. Anne-Marie gave an exasperated sigh. "Can I go now, please?" she asked impatiently. The soldier reached for the apple. He noted its brown spots and made a face of disgust. "No meat?" he asked, glancing at the basket and the napkin that lay at its bottom. Anne-Marie gave him a withering look. "You know we have no meat," she said insolently. "Your army eats all of Denmark's meat." "Please, please," she implored in her mind, "don't lift the napkin." The soldier laughed. He dropped the bruised apple on the ground. One of the dogs leaned forward, pulling at his leash, sniffed the apple, and stepped back. But both dogs still looked intently at the basket, their ears alert, their mouths open, saliva glistening on their smooth pink gums. "My dogs smell meat," the soldier said. "Well, they must smell squirrels in the woods," Anne-Marie responded. "You should take them hunting." The soldier reached forward with the cheese in one hand as if he were going to return it to the basket, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled out the flowered cotton napkin. Anne-Marie froze. "Your uncle has a pretty little lunch," the soldier said scornfully, crumpling the napkin around the cheese in his hand. "Like a woman," he added with contempt. Then his eyes locked on the basket. He handed the cheese and napkin to the soldier behind him. "What's that? There, in the bottom?" he asked in a different, tenser voice. Oh gosh, what would Kirsty do? Anne-Marie stamped her foot like Kirsty. Suddenly, to her own surprise, she began to cry. "I don't know," she said, her voice choked. "My mother's going to be angry that you stopped me and made me late, and you've completely ruined Uncle Henrik's lunch, and now he'll be mad at me too." The dogs whined and struggled against the leashes, nosing forward to the basket. One of the other soldiers muttered something in German. The soldier took out the packet. "Why was this so carefully hidden?" he snapped. Anne-Marie wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. It wasn't hidden. Well, any more than the napkin was. I don't know what it is. And that, she realized, was actually true. She had no idea what was in that packet. The soldier tore the paper open while below him on the ground the dogs strained and snarled, pulling against their leashes. Their muscles were visible beneath the sleek, short-haired flesh. He looked inside, then glared at Anne-Marie. "Stop crying, you idiot girl," he said harshly. "Your stupid mother has sent your uncle a handkerchief. In Germany, the women have better things to do. They don't stay home hemming handkerchiefs for their men." He gestured with the folded white cloth and gave a short, caustic laugh. "At least she didn't stitch flowers on it." He flung it to the ground, still half wrapped in the paper, beside the apple. The dogs lunged, sniffed at it eagerly, then subsided, disappointed again. "Go on," the soldier said. He dropped the cheese and the napkin back into her basket. "Go on to your uncle and you tell him the German dogs enjoyed his bread." All of the soldiers pushed past her. One of them laughed, and then they spoke to each other in their own language again. In a moment, they had disappeared down the path in the direction from which Anne-Marie had just come. Quickly, she picked up the apple and the opened packet with the white handkerchief inside. Just so you guys know, a handkerchief is basically like a tissue, but it's made of cloth, so it's something that gets washed over and over. She put them into the basket and ran around the bend toward the harbor, where the morning sky was now bright with early sun and some of the boat engines were starting their strident din. The Ingeborg was still there by the dock, and Uncle Henrik was there, his light hair windblown and bright as he knelt by his nets. Anne-Marie called to him, and he came to the side. His face was worried when he recognized her on the dock. She handed the basket across. "Mama sent you lunch," she said, her voice quivering. "But soldiers stopped me, and they took your bread." She didn't dare to tell him more. Henrik glanced quickly into the basket. She could see the look of relief on his face and knew that it was because he saw that the packet was there, even though it was torn open. "Thank you," he said, and the relief was evident in his voice. Anne-Marie looked quickly around the familiar small boat. She could see down the passageway into the empty cabin. There was no sign at all of the Rosens or the others. Uncle Henrik followed her eyes and her puzzled look. "All is well, Anne-Marie," he said softly. "Don't worry. Everything is all right." "I wasn't sure if it was going to be," he said. "But now," and he eyed what was in the basket, "because of you, Anne-Marie, everything is going to be all right. You run home now and tell your mama not to worry. I will see you this evening." He grinned at her suddenly. "They took my bread, huh?" he said. "Well, I hope they choke on it." And that's the end of chapters 14 and 15. So we got our climax. Anne-Marie being stopped in the woods by the soldiers. We also found out what was in the packet, a handkerchief, which is basically like a tissue, but one that you can wash and reuse over and over. So there must be more to this handkerchief than just a regular old handkerchief, because he made it sound like she saved the day by bringing that handkerchief, and Mama made it sound like that packet was the most important thing. So hopefully we find out what that was all about. All right, guys, so do your exit ticket. Study your vocabulary on Quizlet. Tomorrow, you'll complete the study guide. There will not be an exit ticket tomorrow, so you'll just complete the study guide. It is not for a grade. It's just to help you with prepare for your test. Study the Quizlet, and then on Friday, you will take your Number the Stars, chapters 11 through 15 test. It is open book and open note. And then on Monday, plan on working on your ABC book. And that's it for me. So I will be sharing everything with you, but I probably won't see you in video again until Tuesday. Okay, so have a fantastic rest of the week. Have a great weekend. I miss you all terribly, actually. And hugs and kisses coming your way. Bye.